At any rate, welcome to Who's the Bad Guy? This is Dave Gahary on the American Free Press Radio Network, and thank you for tuning in. Today we have a special show again. This is, I believe, let me check this out here. I think this might be part 5 or 6. Maybe it's part 6. Let me see. Let me see what we got here. We've got part 6 of 13. Speaking with Michael Collins Piper about his book, Ye Shall Know the Truth, 101 Books American Nationalists Need to Read and Understand Before They Burn Them. And this chapter, Chapter 5, is, let me read you the title of it. And this is my favorite chapter so far. Chapter 5, an overview of the underworld, the truth about organized crime. What I loved about this chapter is that if you really want to know what happens in the United States and who pulls the strings, well, this chapter really tells you. It's pretty scary. It's like it's another dimension, another world. If you're the type of person who consumes the mass media and the mass culture, then you're in that world. You're in that other world. If you're the type of person who likes to see beyond the curtain, then just like, I guess, that movie, The Matrix, right? About the pills, you take this pill or that pill and blah, 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 so on and so forth. It is true because almost everything that we see is not true. It's not the case. It's not the way it really is, sadly. So this chapter really is terrific, and Mike is going to be on in a few minutes to talk all about it. And we have up to 2 hours. Don't know how long we're going to go, but we do have up to 2 hours. And, of course, we have live listeners, but most of the listeners here are archived. So, again, thanks for tuning in. Let me do a little business here before we get into it. American Free Press, national newspaper, sponsors this radio program, and you can go to AmericanFreePress.net. There's another interview I did with a Canadian Jew who is part of a coalition to put up those disappearing Palestine ads on buses and in a train station, and they're successful. Very interesting. This one picture, this one image of Palestine back in 1947 and then in 2010 it's frightening what the Israeli Jews are doing to these indigenous people. They're really crushing them and squeezing them into smaller and smaller areas, really with the full support of this country, the United States, because as many people have said over the decades, the United States is controlled by Zionists, and it seems to be the case. I mean, if you look at it, in a scholarly fashion, there really is no other way that you can. Well, you can't come to a different conclusion. It is. It just is, sadly. And although you might want to, you can't. So anyway, if you don't know that already, you'll find out if you study this stuff, if you subscribe to American Free Press, if you listen to bright people like Mike Piper, who have been doing this for decades and have written many books on this. Mike is just a font of knowledge. I love it. Without any further ado, I'm going to welcome Mike Piper to the show. Mike.
Yeah, hi, Dave. It's good to be back aboard. I've found I want to thank you for this series because it's helped me bring into perspective a lot of my own thinking about a lot of things in reviewing, what I've written in this book, Ye Shall Know the Truth. And, that's the thing. I point that out. One of the chapters in this book, one of the opening chapters is it's entitled, Yes, This is a Full-Length Book in Answer to Your Inquiries, because over the years, when I've been writing for American Free Press and in my books and, when I've appeared on radio shows, people are always asking me, well, what other books can I read or what should I read, And so consequently, that's why I wrote this book. I sat down one day and made a list off the top of my head of about 100 books. It ultimately turned down into more than that. But I made a list off the top of my head of about 100 books that I felt that came to mind that had been valuable to me over the years in one form or another in writing about the various subjects that I have written about, or in subject areas that I knew were of interest to readers of American Free Press, and consequently, that's how this book evolved. And this book, Ye Shall Know the Truth, is not just a list of books. It's written in narrative form. I'm one of the few people in the world who reads books about books. I mean, I find the subject very interesting. I just ordered a book about books fiction books that have featured characters based on the late Huey P. Long. And I just ordered another book, which is a history of book covers, of book jackets.
Wow.
So I have a very deep interest in books above and beyond writing them. I read a lot of them, and I read books about books, but a lot of people don't read books about books. And in fact, that's what I said in the opening pages of this book. I say books about books are seldom bestsellers, and so it doesn't surprise me. But this book, Ye Shall Know the Truth, obviously we've talked about various aspects of it, and today we're going to talk about organized crime in America and really so much of what we don't know about it. We think we know a lot about it. And if people heard the last program here, you asked me, you said, give them a preview. And I said, everybody has seen The Godfather. Everybody has seen The Sopranos. And I love the Godfather films. I love The Sopranos. I don't watch television, but I watch The Sopranos on video, on DVD, twice, as a matter of fact. Over a period of years, watched through the whole series, and it's very entertaining. It's very interesting. It's largely factual. I mean, it reflects a lot of detail about how organized crime does work. But in the bigger picture, the truth about organized crime and its history in America has been largely suppressed. In one respect, what I think a lot of Americans don't understand is that, they think kind of organized crime operates in a vacuum, that you have, quote unquote, the mafia or the mob operating out there, and then you have government operating over here, and the general picture is that the good guys in law enforcement in the government go after the bad guys in organized crime. And I might mention, I'm going to try to avoid using the word mafia as much as possible here in the course of our discussion, because as honest people will admit, organized crime is much bigger than the mafia. There are elements in organized crime that can or historically could be considered the mafia, and we're referring specifically to Italian-American crime syndicates that have operated on American soil. Mm-hmm. But the term the mafia is not ethnically, historically, politically, organizationally accurate to describe the criminal underworld superstructure that exists and has existed in this country for a long, long time.
Would it be
my point earlier, before I digress,
Nostra, Mike?
I'm sorry, what?
Would it be kosher nostra?
People have used that term, but even that might overstate it in some respects. But I will say right up front, there's absolutely no question that the key levels of organized crime in America have always largely been in Jewish hands, not in Italian hands. That's right. But what most people don't understand is they look at things from the perspective of I guess the old show The Untouchables, where crime busting Elliot Ness, played by Robert Stack, went after the mob,
Right.
But the truth is, and this is underscored quite heavily in this chapter in my book, citing a lot of valuable resource material from incomparably mainstream sources. The bottom line fact is that organized crime has intersected at the highest levels of policy making in America, that key figures in American political history have been closely aligned with organized crime interests at a very intimate level. And this is, again, something that people don't understand. You know, people that who have been trained by Hollywood, so to speak. You know, they know that we'll hear stories about a crooked politician who's in bed with the mob. You know, I mean, that, you know, people know there's, you know, but they think that those are anomalies. They think that that's just something that happens in the big cities or something that happens somewhere else. But I'm here to tell you that one of the foremost politicians in America who had a history of involvement at a very intimate level with organized crime throughout his entire career, even going back prior to the time that he got in politics, I'm here to tell you it was Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Now, I know a lot of our listeners who are admirers of Ronald Reagan are saying, I don't believe that. That's propaganda coming from the Democrats and the liberals.
That's right.
Now, this is the truth. There's a wide variety of information out there about Ronald Reagan. We can go into that later. In the book, of course, I get into that, but suffice it to say, that's a very good example of how high organized crime's tentacles have reached in the American political arena. And you know, Reagan is not the only one. Now, we've heard over the years also, of course, about the fact that organized crime has been involved. We all know that organized crime has been involved in the drug trade, but the heroin, crack, standard old-fashioned cocaine, which was so mild and so minimal compared to crack and some of the other drugs that are plaguing America today. I was going to say plaguing our cities today, but one of the big secrets of drug abuse in America is that it's rampant all over this country, not just in the big cities, but in the nice suburbs and even in rural communities. So it's all over. Not all over America, I should say. And it's not just a black thing, as a lot of people think. It's affecting a lot of nice white kids in nice leafy suburbs. But you know, the one thing that people have come to understand, maybe they haven't come to understand it, but they're coming to see more and more about it and realize that there is something there, is this problem that we have about relating to the fact that organized crime's activities in the realm of the drug trade have in fact intersected with the activities of our own Central Intelligence Agency and other U.S. government agencies. And this is where it gets kind of sticky, because then people start saying, well, the critics of that always dismiss that as a quote-unquote conspiracy theory. However, and they think it's something new that just popped up in the last decade. You know, a lot of people say, oh, yes, that's the story that was broken by Gahary Webb in the I forget the name of the newspaper that he worked for. But Gahary Webb, in fact, did create quite a stir with his book that came out, or with these stories that he wrote for this newspaper, talking about, it was the Sacramento Bee in California, talking about the interaction between the CIA and the drug cartels bringing crack cocaine into this country. Now, a lot of people said, oh, well, that doesn't mean that they did it everywhere. They only did it in Sacramento. That was just one particular case, you know, that Gahary Webb was writing about. And that's kind of how the mass media covered up for it. But as I point out, one of the good books on the topic is a book by Alexander Coburn and Jeffrey St. Clair, and they did a book entitled The CIA, Drugs, and the Press. Now, their book focused on the controversy surrounding Gary Webb, but they made it clear that the American press, which is supposed to be the guardian of freedom in this country, the press went out of its way to dismiss Gary Webb's stories, to dismiss the idea that the CIA would ever do anything so outrageous as to collaborate with international drug cartels and bringing drugs into this country. But they make it very, very clear that these things were happening and that the press indeed was helping cover it up. Well, there's multiple directions you can go in this. But again, as I point out in Ye Shall Know the Truth, the revelations coming from Gary Webb were really nothing new. Going back to I remember seeing the book for the first time when I was a kid. It was in my local library, and it was issued by Harper and Row, which is a mainstream publishing house, in 1972, and it was the book The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. And it was by Dr. Alfred McCoy of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And, the CIA tried to block publication of the book, but they failed. However, once it was out there, they engaged in a lot of covert machinations, which kind of suppressed distribution of the book. But it ended up in my little local library where I was growing up in Pennsylvania. And I remember looking at the book at the time. Now, I was in 1972. I was 12 years old, and I had pretty much concluded that drugs were a bad thing. The drugs were bad. Heroin was bad. So I remember picking the book up, and it was a little too deep for me at the time. But I said to myself, boy, oh boy, I read the book, or read parts of it anyway, and it kind of, I guess I didn't understand the ramifications of it. Because I knew drugs were bad, and I knew bad people used drugs, and bad people sold drugs. And, I subsequently came to find out that a lot of good people do use drugs, and it's destroyed their lives and destroyed their families. So I've learned a little bit about that from knowing people and seeing what drugs have done, and I just don't dismiss people who use drugs as being bad people. But at any case, I remember at the time reading the book, and I didn't quite grasp the larger geopolitical ramifications of it. But the book was telling me that our own government had actually helped import drugs into the United States. Well, it was some years went by, of course, before I finally, I remembered that book, and I pieced it together with other things that I was learning over the years, and then I subsequently was kind of amused to see years and years later, from 1972 to the 1990s when the story by Gary Webb came out. I mean, it was like I was saying to myself, this is nothing new. This is old stuff to me, and the thing is, if more people had seen the original book that Dr. McCoy wrote, they would have known about it already. His book was reissued in 1992 under the title The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade. And then it was reissued in 2003. And what's interesting is in the newer versions, Dr. McCoy has been able to write about the CIA's operations in trying to suppress his book. But as I say, all of this stuff, this data about the interaction between the upper world and the underworld, it's very disturbing to good people, to good Americans. Now, it's disturbing to, it's disturbing to all people who care about honesty in government, who oppose drug abuse, who are concerned about the effects that it has on our society, the impact of drug money laundering, which involves the big banks. American Free Press has written about that. So most of what I'm talking about, to one degree or another, doesn't come as a surprise to the regular readers of American Free Press. But I guarantee you, if what I was talking about was exposed to the average, good, decent American, they might even say that I was a communist or a traitor or, anti-American for saying these kind of things because, they just don't like to think that our government gets involved in these things. But the reason why the CIA gets involved in these things, whether it's with organized crime right here on American shores, or whether it's because of excuse me, or getting involved with international drug cartels. The reason why they do it is because it's approved. And the reason why it's approved is because there's a lot of nice politicians and nice people in communities all across America, ranging from small-town Pennsylvania to rural North Dakota to big city Los Angeles and all over. There are these politicians who are in bed with organized crime. And they're not just in bed with them, they're screwing with them in bed, to put it bluntly, in a very beneficial and loving relationship, I might as well add. The politicians benefit because the mob gives them money, whether through bribes and campaign contributions, and also another factor, and again I go into it in this chapter in the book, is that the organized crime, and let us be honest about this, largely Jewish organized crime syndicates, have had a substantial lock on the political machines in some of the major cities in this country. And I mention that in the book in the sense that I talk about the way in which in 1952 Senator Estes Kefauver, who he liked to gamble, he liked to hit the casinos. He dealt in adulterous relationships with a lot of women of easy virtue. I mean, he was pretty notorious as a womanizer. But he campaigned against organized crime. He conducted very famous hearings on organized crime, and he made some very substantial enemies within the mob. And when he was running quite successfully for president in 1952, what happened was that he was doing so well that the mob all over the country didn't quite know how to handle him because the mob was tied in with all of the key Democratic Party machines in all the big cities around the country. And, of course, they controlled a substantial number of delegates to the 1952 Democratic Convention. And it didn't seem like there was any candidate for president who could stop Kefauver. Well, ultimately, what they said was, oh, my God, we're coming into the Democratic National Convention here. It looks like Kefauver is going to get the nomination. Well, all the big city Jewish crime syndicate-controlled Democratic machines got together, and they said, all right, we got to just find somebody who's willing to take the fall against Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower, of course, by this time. Dwight Eisenhower was no bargain himself. That's another story for another time. But Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican candidate. He was generally perceived to have the lead, and any Democrat that was put up against him was likely to lose. But the Democratic Party machines that were controlled by the Jewish crime syndicate elements decided that they would rather lose with a candidate that they could control, or at least would be neutral towards him, rather than take the chance of Estes Kefauver being the nominee. So, bottom line, they got together and went to Adlai Stevenson, who was then the governor of Illinois, and said, Adlai, we know you'd like to run for re-election as governor, but would you please step in here? We need to stop Kefauver. And Adlai Stevenson was a smart fellow with a big ego, and I happen to be an admirer of Adlai Stevenson. Well, Stevenson stepped in, and they took the nomination, They united behind him, took the nomination away from Kefauver, and, of course, Stevenson got clobbered in a general election by Eisenhower. And it's very, very interesting to note that one of the Jewish-controlled Democratic machines was up there in Minnesota. Now, no one ever thinks of Minnesota as being a place where there would be organized crime, for God's sake, not Minnesota.
No.
I mean, New Jersey, look, Dave, you're in New Jersey. Everybody knows about New Jersey. But Minnesota, no. Well, yes, in fact, in Minnesota, and one of the big Jewish-controlled machines in Minnesota had put in as the mayor of Minneapolis no less than a nice reformer known as Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey. A lot of our listeners probably don't remember him. He was vice president from 1964 to 1968 under Lyndon Johnson. He was a jolly sort. He liked to cry and moan, and he was a big-time liberal. He was relatively popular. Nixon defeated him in the 1968 presidential election. But what people do not remember is the fact that this guy who was mayor of Minneapolis was also the product of the Jewish crime syndicate in Minneapolis. In fact, Jewish crime in those northern tier states bordering Canada has been an interesting phenomenon, and I'll get into that in a moment. But it's kind of interesting to note that when Hubert Humphrey was sworn in as Vice President of the United States, the guy he asked to hold the Bible was a good political friend of his from Minnesota, who was actually one of the local Jewish crime syndicate figures. Now, of course, that wasn't his official image. I mean, he was supposed to be, a nice Jewish businessman in Minneapolis. Did I say Cincinnati? If I did, I meant Minneapolis.
No, I think I could be
okay,
wrong
but this is the guy who held the Bible when Hubert Humphrey was sworn in, and so the reason why he was so close to the mob was that that they controlled Minneapolis, and that's where he became mayor, and later went on to the United States Senate, became vice president, ran for president. I mean, who in the world would ever think that Hubert Humphrey was tied up with organized crime? But indeed he was. And, I want to mention one of the reasons why a lot of these northern tier states have a big Jewish crime syndicate influence there. Even states like North Dakota, for God's sake. I mean, the mob in North Dakota? Well, remember, North Dakota and all these other states are on the border. And guess what they do on the border? They smuggle drugs, and in Prohibition, they smuggled liquor into the United States. And consequently, up in Canada, the big Jewish crime syndicate families like the Bronfmans had a lot of outposts all over Canada with neighboring contingents in the United States responsible for smuggling drugs and liquor into the United States. So there are still remnants of those criminal elements active at work in those states today. And again, it just goes to show you the depth of organized crime and where it has taken the most unlikely routes. Right. I told this story quite recently. It may have even been in one of our previous discussions, and I think it illustrates kind of the nature of how people approach organized crime in their communities and when it's within their midst. I was born in a small city in central Pennsylvania. Didn't grow up there, but I was born there, and my brother lived there for many years, and I had a lot of family there, still have some family there today. And during that time period, my much older brother had a very pretty, very nice Jewish girlfriend. And he eventually broke up with her. I think she left the area. That's irrelevant one way or the other. But anyway, he had this very pretty, very nice Jewish girlfriend. I remember her well. Matter of fact, I think I had a bit of a crush on her. You know, I was a little kid, and they were much older than I was. And I remember right around that time the shock that rolled through the community when this Jewish girl's father died in an accident on an interstate highway in Pennsylvania, along with his Gentile trophy wife, his second wife. And I remember seeing it was a shock to my family because it was my brother's girlfriend's father. And my family, I guess, had known them very casually through my brother and his girlfriend. But, I mean, they were not friends by any means. But I remember seeing the big headlines in the local newspaper about this distinguished local businessman who had died in this accident. And his wife had survived, et cetera, et cetera. You get the picture. Well, you know what? It was about 20 years later that I was talking to my brother. He had since gotten married and raised a family, and I mentioned his Jewish girlfriend and her father. And he said, he was murdered. And I said, what? I said, it was at that accident on the highway. He said, no, they blew up his car. He was coming back from a big mob meeting in Pittsburgh. Now, my brother worked for this guy. And I said, oh, for God's sake, that's right. And I remembered this guy that my brother worked for. My brother, the guy had a pinball machine business. And that arena, pinball machines and poker machines and so forth, has always had a big contingent-related organized crime activity, money laundering and so forth. Had never occurred to me as a child. I never thought much more about it. My brother, I think, delivered the machines for him, or just was collected the money from the machines, or did something for a brief period of time. Not like my brother was involved in the syndicate or anything like that, because he wasn't. But his boss was. And they had blown this guy up in his car. And, here's my point, that it was like an open secret that this respected local businessman, a leader in the Jewish community, was in the mob. And when he was murdered, blown up on the highway, driving his car back from a mob meeting, the local newspaper reported it just as a tragic traffic accident. And yet, it was an open secret among those who knew these things that this guy was involved in the mob. And this is just an innocuous small city. Maybe really could only be described as a large town in central Pennsylvania. And Dave, I'm here to tell you, it's not just in northern New Jersey. It's not just in New Orleans. It's not just in Dallas. It's all over America. And key figures in organized crime all over America include respected businessmen, Jewish and non-Jewish alike.
But Mike,
and these are the guys who make the politicians who rule America.
Right, exactly. But let me ask you this, though. And first let me say this before I ask you this question, because this is something that I'd love to have an answer to. And, of course, I am going to get to the books that you recommend in this chapter, because this is something I'm very fascinated with. But I wanted to remind the listeners that there is a call-in number here. It's 347-215-7292, 347-215-7292 if you want to ask Mike any questions. Mike, why is it that why do you think it is that Jews are so highly represented in organized crime?
That's a very interesting story, and I can tell you that there's actually been a lot of writing on that by Jewish authors. And essentially the argument that they make, this is the argument that they make, that Jews came to this country and that they were oppressed, that they had been oppressed throughout the centuries, and organized crime was a way for them to integrate into their local communities Yeah, this is the argument. I'm trying to present this in a straightforward fashion, without even a hint of a tone of sarcasm in my voice. But
I don't know how you do. I don't know how you do it, man.
But this is the argument that's made that there were flourishing organized crime communities in which young Jewish men primarily had already become inducted, and these guys were. It was the American way to be successful, and these guys were making money very quickly and very successfully in the white slave trade, prostitution, drugs, gambling, and that this was a way to get ahead, and that a lot of young men, young Jewish men in the late 19th century, early 20th century, consequently moved into these rackets, into organized crime, and because they were so hardworking and studious and abstemious, and were good family men who didn't like to drink and use drugs themselves, they became, and naturally because they were intelligent and hardworking, they quickly rose to leadership positions in the syndicate. And, it's interesting because I think it was Moment magazine. I don't have the information handy at the moment, but I actually made reference to this in my book, Confessions of an Anti-Semite. A few years ago, Moment magazine had a very interesting article about some Jewish entrepreneur who realized that so many American Jews could claim familial connections to people who had been involved in organized crime all over America in the various communities. And in years past, while they didn't like to talk about it to a certain degree, it's become quite fashionable for Jewish folks to make a claim that they had a member of the syndicate in their family. And so this guy makes his money by researching organized crime, and if someone has a family they think's connected to organized crime, a family member, then this guy will give them the whole history. So he's made a buck on this, and Moment magazine, which is a Jewish-owned magazine published by Jewish people with a focus on Jewish community affairs, essentially said in this article that many Jews today are really proud of the fact that they had a family member who was involved in organized crime. And, it's quite chic, of course, to say that in a lot of circles, But, I guess when I was growing up, call me old-fashioned. I didn't think that it was something glamorous, I remember telling somebody, the Newhouse family, who control Advanced Publications, and now they bought up old S.I. Newhouse, when the old man. Let me backtrack for a moment, set this in context for people. The current Newhouse family is run by S.I. Newhouse, who they call Cy, and his brother Donald. And they are some of the wealthiest people in America. They have been in the top 10 wealth. They've been in the top 10 of the Forbes 400. They're worth anywhere between $8 to $10 billion. It could be more by this time. It could be less, but incredibly wealthy. Their father was Samuel I. Newhouse, and old Mr. Newhouse, who started the dynasty. When he bought the Times-Picayune newspaper in New Orleans, he said, "I just bought New Orleans."
Wow.
Yeah, that's what he said, and he did. And they own the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Harrisburg Patriot, a whole raft of smaller newspapers surrounding Harrisburg, the state capital. They own Vanity Fair magazine, The New Yorker. They own Parade, the weekly Sunday supplement. Okay, they've got a lock on a lot of media all over the country. And I mentioned to someone who works for one of the Newhouse papers that the Newhouse family, at least back in the old days, and still, let's face it, that they had ties to the crime syndicate. And this young lady said, "Ooh, that's kind of exciting." She kind of got a thrill about the fact that this family that she works for was tied up with these elements that have been responsible for prostitution and drugs and liquor and gambling,
right,
you know,
and suffering and human suffering.
Yeah, and I mean, look, you know what I mean. I don't claim to be any. I can, as I said to somebody, I can still drink most people under the table. You know what I mean? And, I like to go to the racetrack. You know what I mean? So I'm not this puritanical crusader. I'm not Carrie Nation with a hatchet. But I can step back and look at the big picture. And understand the bigger ramifications of what I'm talking about here. That organized crime connected interests are in control of one of the biggest newspaper syndicates in the country, newspaper chains in the country, that I can look upon this and realize that they have a control over the politicians in those cities, and those politicians and those newspapers have an impact on the national political course and discourse in this country. I mean, the Newhouse chain alone, this is kind of going a long direction from what you originally asked me, Dave, but I think
that's okay.
In some respects, it answers it,
Yes.
The Newhouse chain alone, they are known for exercising their political clout in a very quiet way, but in a very real way in their communities. In addition, Cy Newhouse, who is now the big figure in the family, he's getting old, but he has been known to be a political fixer on behalf of the Jewish lobby. Back when Senator Jesse Helms was running for re-election years ago, and the Jews didn't like him, and Jewish money from all over the United States was coming into North Carolina to defeat Jesse Helms, Jesse Helms made a phone call to somebody who was very close to Cy Newhouse. And I'll talk about that person in a moment. Well, that person called Cy Newhouse, this big media tycoon, this Jewish billionaire. Cy Newhouse made a few phone calls to other Jewish figures around the country, and the tide of Jewish money to Helms' Democratic challenger, Jim Hunt, was cut off. All of a sudden, Hunt didn't have any more money. How much money then the Jews actually gave to Jesse Helms, I don't know. But the Jewish tide of money against him was cut off. And consequently, Jesse Helms managed to win re-election. And it was after Jesse Helms won re-election that he went from being a forthright critic of U.S. foreign aid to Israel and really just a general critic of U.S. support for Israel. He did a complete 180-degree turnabout and became one of the most fervent supporters of Israel in the United States Senate. And that was a direct consequence of the involvement of this respected Jewish philanthropist, Cy Newhouse, whose family has been tied up with organized crime to one degree or another from the very beginning. To the point that it was this individual who called Cy Newhouse, who was very interesting because it was Cy Newhouse's lifelong friend, a New York Jewish attorney by the name of Roy Cohen, who made that phone call. Roy Cohen was long active in the Republican Party. He was a close friend of William F. Buckley, Jr. In fact, it was Roy Cohen we discovered in the old Spotlight days, the Spotlight being the newspaper that was an essential forerunner of American free press. We found out that when William F. Buckley, Jr., Cohen's good friend, was trying to get his magazine National Review established, that it was this Jewish attorney named Roy Cohen who actually went to the Anti-Defamation League and got the ADL's approval for Buckley's magazine to get newsstand sales in the United States. Now, people say, wait a minute, I don't get the connection. Why would a respected Jewish civil rights group like the Anti-Defamation League have any impact on whether or not a conservative magazine like William F. Buckley's National Review, could get in the newsstands. Well, the reason why is because, and this ties into, again, the whole newspaper business and why people like the Newhouse family and the famous Annenberg family of Philadelphia, which produced Walter Annenberg, who was U.S. ambassador to England under Richard Nixon. The newspaper distribution business, in many respects, has long been one of the sidelines of organized crime, or they've had a big impact on it in the big cities in the United States. And consequently, and this is a fact, it has been largely Jewish-controlled interests, or Jewish interests, which control newspaper distribution, even if they don't own the newspapers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So historically here in the United States, the newsstand business has been in Jewish hands, and because it is in Jewish hands, they're naturally in tune with the Anti-Defamation League, which has units in every city of consequence, in every large town of consequence all across this country.
They're fully infested.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I found out, I think I mentioned this before, I found out just a few weeks ago that the Jewish lawyer who handled some obscure legal matters for my parents back in the early 1960s, it turns out he was the local on-site representative for the Anti-Defamation League.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, not that, for all I know, whatever my parents, in those days, I was just a child, so the Anti-Defamation League didn't have an handle on me in those days. But
right.
If someone in New York, the point being that I would imagine this Jewish lawyer probably gave the ADL access to any information they wanted about his clients. That's just how it works, But anyway, to try to bring this full circle. You see, when you get talking about things like this, it does illustrate the breadth and the depth of organized crime influence, particularly when it's Jewish organized crime, because that adds a whole another layer of intrigue to what we're talking about. So Roy Cohn was the guy. This guy was a longtime mob fixer. He was extraordinarily brilliant. He was one hell of a lawyer. He was the kind of guy his clients would go crazy. He had legitimate clients as well, but he represented a lot of mob interests, including Italian American crime syndicate folks. He didn't discriminate. But Roy Cohn was so brilliant that Roy Cohn was what a friend of mine would have called a sexual nut. He apparently was a drug user. He had a large sexual appetite. He was homosexual and was notorious for a very wild sex life. Although he did date Barbara Walters for a while. Barbara Walters herself had a lot of organized crime connections, and I'm going to do a story about that sometime.
What's her real name, Mike?
It is Barbara Walters. That's her real name, Barbara Walters.
Oh, okay.
Her father was a Jewish businessman named Lou Walters, who once he was having some problems with money problems connected to the mob, it was Roy Cohn who fixed things for him. So Roy Cohn, though, was a brilliant guy, and he would come into court not having read the client's case or anything like that. He would just pick up the paperwork and scan it very quickly, and he was able to absorb the foundation of the case without having done a lot of his homework, and he could stand up there in court and brilliantly argue like he had spent the last week studying the case and all the legal cases relative thereto. So this guy Roy Cohn, he was sharp. And over the years, he did a lot of fixing for the Newhouse family. And in fact, old Cy Newhouse gave Roy Cohn, I forget how much it was, he loaned him some extraordinary sum of money. Because Roy Cohn was very flamboyant, not only in his sex life, but in his general lifestyle, was constantly in debt, went through millions and millions of dollars. Cy Newhouse gave Cy Newhouse Sr., I believe it was, gave Roy Cohn a big pile of money, ostensibly as a loan, which Cohen never paid back. But, you know, I'm focusing here on Roy Cohn and the Newhouse family because they are a perfect, they're perfectly illustrative of how these great Jewish philanthropists and media tycoons have these underworld connections that they use for political advancement, for financial glory. You know, it's just a perfect case example of it. But as I say, it reaches everywhere in this country, and even particularly through the Newhouse family because of their vast wealth and because of the fact that they own a lot of smaller newspapers around the country. And consequently, whenever they say, you know, whenever they call the shots, let's put it that way. Somebody once said that what you have to worry about is not what is published in the Newhouse papers, but what is not published. You know, so a lot of people, you know, this is the kind of thing, if you really sit back and think about it, a lot of people would be thinking that, oh, these newspapers are publishing a lot of propaganda. And that is naturally a concern, you know, if a newspaper is controlled by, you know, any particular ethnic persuasion or any particular political persuasion or, you know, financial interest, you might expect that they're going to use that newspaper to publish material that will advance their interests. Well, yes, they do, and that's a real concern. But in this particular case, what they were saying about the Newhouse family was that what the Newhouse family does is they don't tend to interfere in a lot of the editorial decisions of these local newspapers. They let them operate. They want to make as much money as possible. But when it's necessary for some political reason or some financial reason, that's when the hammer comes down. And a lot of times, in the case of the Newhouse family, evidently, it's things that they keep from being published. And let's not just say that only the Newhouse family does that. That's what happens with a lot of these big newspapers and small newspapers around the country. So sometimes the danger is from people not getting the news that they should be getting. And consequently, you have to consider it in this realm as well. If the owner of the newspaper is tied up with the Jewish crime syndicate or any crime syndicate, and he's using his influence as the publisher of the local newspaper to whatever degree, whether on a regular, aggressive basis or otherwise, to influence elections in the community or to influence the course of debate about some issue, then you have to realize that if any of the issues that have come up, or if any of the politicians that are seeking office happen to be campaigning against the interests of those Jewish crime syndicate families and the people they're allied with in the political machines that we've talked about, then your local newspaper might not be giving you the news you need to know. So it's all very circular. It's all very circular, and it raises the question then as to the degree of influence. Well, we know the answer. The influence of organized crime in America is so far more substantial than people realize. And as I say, that's why I started out at this very, it comes full circle at this point, that people just don't realize that these two things operate. They think they operate separately. You have the mob on the one hand and your government and law enforcement and the police departments on the other. But in fact, they often are actually one. And it's not just great. Hollywood. It's not just something you see in the movies. This is the way it really is. And
great,
I'll give you. I know you want to pursue something else here, Dave. But I'm gonna mention one more thing here. It's in the book. It's in my book. Ye shall know the truth. And it kind of represents again another example of what we're talking about here, of how the media will suppress something when it deals with specifically with Jewish connections to organized crime and the drug syndicate. And it's a downbeat story because it makes someone who otherwise appears to be a hero look less than the hero he's perceived to be. And I'm talking about the late Gary Webb. You know, Gary Webb died of several gunshot wounds. A lot of people think he committed suicide, or that he was murdered, because he had, I think, 2 head wounds. In fact, if you know anything about this, which I do, because I used to read a lot of books about, long before the stuff was popular, I might add, on television, I used to read a lot of books about forensics and crime scene investigations. A lot of times when people shoot themselves in the head, and this is rather grotesque, but in case anybody out there is thinking about shooting yourself in the head, keep this in mind. A lot of times they don't quite do it right. And the first head wound is just an absolute screw-up. The bullet may only graze the skin. There was one case I read where the bullet went in the guy's temple and circled around his skull and came out the other side and only gave him basically a cut, more or less. You know, I mean, point is, Gary Webb tried to shoot himself. Didn't work the first time, so he shot himself again, and that time it worked. Well, a lot of people say he was murdered. I don't think so. And the reason why I say that, and it's a lot of people say, Piper's a government man. Some of these hucksters and carnival barkers will come out and say, that proves Piper's a government man. He says that Gary Webb committed suicide when he was really murdered, you know. Well, no. No reason to murder Gary Webb. He'd already made his splash in the media. He basically had said what he had to say. Maybe he had some story that he'd never broken. That's entirely possible. But he probably did commit suicide.
Yeah, I didn't know about him until I...
Yeah, he might have been murdered. He might have been murdered, but ultimately it's irrelevant. But I wanted to mention that because people will say, you know, if I don't mention it, people will think I'm covering it up or, you know that kind of thing. I guess I'm covering myself in advance for what I know will be criticisms if I don't mention it. But I can tell you a story about Gary Webb, and I mention it in the book, and oddly enough, I mention it at the exact end of the chapter. It goes back to the old Spotlight days. Now, Andrew St. George, who worked for the Spotlight, he never wrote under his name Andrew St. George, but he wrote under the name George Nicholas and Sasha Rakotsi and several other colorful pen names. But Andrew St. George was a remarkable individual who knew everybody. He was at one point considered the golden boy for Henry Luce at Time magazine. Andrew's been described as a paramilitary journalist. If you look up the name Andrew St. George being spelled capital S, small t, period, capital G, E-O-R-G, period, you'll find some fascinating details about Andrew's life. He's mentioned in a number of books, and usually the stories about Andrew are very, very colorful. And as I say, Andrew knew everybody, and he was a great guy, and we all miss him. Wonderful, wonderful, one of those people, the true personalities that you meet. Andrew knew everybody, from Fidel Castro to Frank Costello, the mobster, knew everybody, and just quite a guy. Knew Frank Sturgis, the Watergate burglar. Andrew's the kind of guy who could do a whole show on Andrew. Maybe we should do a whole show on Andrew sometime. But anyway, sure. Andrew had remarkable contacts in the intelligence community and within the Arab world, in the diplomatic community, in the intelligence community, in the military. Consequently, he got a lot of interesting stuff on the Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. And one of the stories, a series of stories that Andrew was working on for the Spotlight, and we published many, many stories in this regard over the years, was a story about the Mossad's pivotal role in the international drug trade, the history of it and the current involvement of it in the drug trade at that time, and I'm sure it's still there. And he heard of Gary Webb doing these stories for the Sacramento Bee, and anybody who was even vaguely intelligent in the press, if they heard the name Andrew St. George and did any amount of checking on him, they found that he was somebody to be reckoned with, somebody who had a lot of connections and knew a lot of people. Consequently, Andrew arranged to meet with Gahary Webb at a deli in New York City. And I'm sure Gahary Webb, who was a relatively young guy, was intrigued by the opportunity to sit down with this legendary Andrew St. George. Well, Andrew told me this story himself. He said that what they were going to talk about was the drug trade, which, of course, Gahary Webb had become famous writing about. Well, they had hardly sat down when Andrew mentioned the subject of Mossad involvement with the CIA and the drug racket. And Webb himself, this guy who fearlessly wrote about the CIA and said it was involved in the drug trade here in the United States. The CIA, for God's sake. He wasn't afraid to mention the CIA. But he nervously said to Andrew, he said, "Oh, I could never write about the Mossad." He admitted that he knew the Mossad was involved in the drug trade, but he said he could never, that was his words, never write about the Mossad, or else, he said, he would lose his job. And at that moment, I guess he hadn't even finished his bagel or whatever he'd ordered. Maybe a hot dog, who knows? Gahary Webb fled that New York deli, would not even continue his lunch with Andrew St. George. He did not want to be associated in any way, shape, or form with even discussing what Andrew knew about Mossad involvement in the drug trade. And this is something that Gahary Webb acknowledged that he was aware of, but he said he could never write about it because he would lose his job. Now, that story, for anyone who doubts about Jewish power, for anyone who doubts that the press covers up for the Jewish crime syndicate and for Jewish misdeeds, that story should tell you everything. Gahary Webb, who's not afraid to write about the CIA, and a lot of people are afraid of the CIA, sometimes for the wrong reasons, because I think there's a lot of good people in the CIA who know about what's going on and who are trying to counter it. Same with other government agencies, but Gahary Webb was totally afraid to write about the Mossad because he said he'd lose his job. Does that story tell you everything, or does it, you know what I mean? It just...
Well, it's not, you know what, it does, and it's not just, see, this is why, and Mike, I've mentioned this to you and other people before, but this is why you, and I'm not, blowing sunshine up your butt, I'm telling the truth here. This is why you, as an individual who has absorbed all of this information, this is why you are so important, because here you can recall these things, and you even use words that are in, because I highlighted that particular page, or part on page 103, I highlighted the words perfect case study. I was going to ask you to explain why does Cohn represent a perfect case study? You did.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Yeah, well, that's what I
yeah.
say. It does. I'm glad I wrote that because it does. It absolutely does represent just that. Yeah.
Yes, but that is why this is so. When I cracked open that book later than I should have, then I realized why that book is so important. And I think what you said in the beginning of the broadcast shines light on that also, because you said thank you for doing this series, because it's bringing out a lot in what you have written. And yeah, this is why this book, and Mike's other books, of course, this is why this book is so important, because Mike has so much knowledge from reading. And I've always said this to folks, a lot of folks, oh boy, you know a lot about this, or you know a lot about that, or you did this, you were on the radio, and yeah, but anybody could do it. That's what's great about the United States. Anybody can do it if you put your mind to it. The information is there for your perusal. All you got to do is read, but so few people actually read. And
well, that's it, Dave. I mean, that was the whole point of this book. It was to show people that, I've never had any secret sources to any degree about anything. There have been I've had a few secret sources over the years who provided me information that I couldn't use for a variety of reasons. You know what I mean? But they tipped me off to things that I should have known about, Or I did have one source that I used in my book, Final Judgment, that initially I didn't reveal his name, but I ultimately did, things like that. But no, the information that I'm talking about in this book, and which I'm talking about here on the radio for the most part, is not really secret. Now, the only way I knew about the thing with Andrew St. George and Gary Webb is because Andrew personally told me the story. But, much of the information here, like you say, this is accessible for people for themselves. In Ye Shall Know the Truth, I highlight some stories and some details from a lot of these books. And I'm saying to people, you can go get these books yourself. They're in the library. If they're not in the library, a lot of them are still on sale in the bookstores. And you can certainly get them. 99.9% of them you can get by going to Amazon.com. You know what I mean? This stuff isn't secret. It's out there. Right. People can put it all together for themselves. That's why I say I have no secrets to hide here. I have, my sources are what I say they are. And that's why when I'm writing, I'm usually very careful. I don't fault other people for doing it, but in my own experience, I found it's very, very important to, if you have a quote-unquote mainstream source, then go ahead and mention that mainstream source. Then people can go right to it themselves and say, okay, well, Piper took it out of context or Piper didn't take it out of context. It's pretty clear. You know what I mean? I'm very detail-oriented. I like to put everything out there for people to judge for themselves.
You like links.
Links. Thank you. Yes, I like links. A lot of people don't like links. I like links, And in fact, I owe you some, and I'm going to be sending you some, by the way. Something I was working on here this morning. But at any rate, the information is there, whether it's on the subject of the CIA and drugs or whether it's on organized crime or even organized crime's influence on politicians. Now, it's stuff that isn't always in the headlines. It isn't always in the headlines, but, it's buried, in the pages of books. But these books are there for you to read. We've talked about this before. A lot of people, smaller numbers of books, I'll try to boil a big story down into about one sentence. A smaller number of people buy a smaller number of books than most people realize. Most books don't sell like the books of Stephen King and Danielle Steele, and there's actually in this country, there's very few people who actually buy books. Even among the readers of American Free Press, I can tell you that only a very small number of the many people who read the newspaper ever buy books from American Free Press. And yet the people who do buy books, they're regular customers and they keep coming back. But so even among people who are hungry for alternative news and information, most of them are not really book buyers. At least they're not as represented among the actual readership of the newspaper. And then when you consider the general population in this country who don't even read American Free Press and probably don't even read their local newspaper, how many books do you think they buy?
I try not to think about that much. It's too depressing.
It is in some respects, yeah. Yeah, so this book, Ye Shall Know the Truth, is designed, hey, let's be honest about it, it's designed for the elite. It's designed for the intelligent. And by the elite and the intelligent, I mean those good people out there who are hungry for information, who do look to broaden their horizons, if I could go that far, who are interested in finding out what's being suppressed, or if it's not being suppressed, the things that are out there if they look in the right places to find it.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, 99% of the American people are not interested in those subjects. But thank God the readers of American Free Press and the people who listen to this program and the people who go to AmericanFreePress.net, they are hungry for information. They want to separate the facts and the truth from the lies and the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. So that was the whole purpose of this. And this chapter we've been talking about is just one slice of the big picture. But on the other hand, when you talk about organized crime, you also have to talk about government and public policy. Now, the average American would say, oh, yes, those subjects are interrelated because it's the job of the government to stop crime. Well, no, as we've seen here today and has been documented for a century, if you look in the right places, government and organized crime are often one and the same. As I say, just to the point that a Jewish crime syndicate figure held the Bible on which Hubert Humphrey was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. How much more intimate can you get than that?
You can't.
How much more symbolic can you get than that, for God's sake? You know what I mean? You can talk about a politician taking a payoff from the mob. Yeah, okay. But when a Jewish crime boss who masquerades as a businessman holds the Bible on which your vice president gets sworn in on, what does that say? What does it tell you? You know what I mean? So yes, crime and government interact in a way far more intimate than people realize, even to the degree that people understand that there's a lot of politicians in the pocket of the mob. They don't have any degree of the depth of it. And who would think that Ronald Reagan, of all people, was tied up with the mob? And then when you consider well, let's be honest about it here, the ethnic persuasion of so many of the people who are tied up in organized crime and who in turn then influence public policy in their communities, because of the fact that these people are Jewish, that adds another element to it. It adds another element to it because these people also bankroll, these Jewish criminals in the syndicate are also key financiers behind the Jewish Anti-Defamation League. And the ADL is a major force in the Israeli lobby in this country, and consequently, these local Jewish crime syndicate figures have a direct influence on U.S. foreign policy. They may not care the damnedest about it themselves. They're busy running drugs and prostitution and, extortion rackets and so forth in their local communities. But when they make their money, they give it to Jewish charities. That's how a lot of Jewish mobsters have become considered, quote-unquote, legitimate. And consequently, their money is being used to impact the lobbying that's done on the matter of U.S. foreign policy. And that's why we got involved in wars in the Middle East, because of the Jewish lobby, which is funded to a great degree by organized crime interests. The Anti-Defamation League once gave their annual Torch of Liberty Award in Las Vegas to one of the great Jewish philanthropists named Morris Dalitz, D-A-L-I-T-Z. Now, Morris Dalitz started out, I think, in Detroit, later set up shop in Cleveland, if I'm getting this correctly. It's off the top of my head. I'm getting old now.
I'll look it up.
Morris Dalitz was operating in Detroit. He ran something that was known as the Little Jewish Navy, and that was the shipment of liquor from Canada, from the Bronfman family. They're nice, legitimate Jewish philanthropists now, too. They were smuggling liquor into the United States through the little ships, the Little Jewish Navy run by Morris Dalitz. Well, Dalitz also became involved in gambling and organized crime in Cleveland, and then later relocated to Las Vegas. and set up shop in Las Vegas. And he essentially, for years, was organized crime, the Lansky crime syndicate's key man in Las Vegas. He oversaw the Jewish control of the gambling interests in Las Vegas. Well, consequently brought a lot of business to Las Vegas, and, it made it a gambling mecca, and lots of Americans go there and have a lot of fun. I'm not complaining about that. A lot of people lose their shirts and other parts of their anatomy when they go to Las Vegas. But the point is, here's this guy who was unquestionably a gangster. But the Anti-Defamation League gave him their Torch of Liberty Award. This respected Jewish philanthropist. He was a gangster. Okay, and he helped Las Vegas, yes, but he was a gangster. He exploited women. He thrived on gambling. I didn't see any feminists out there complaining. I didn't see Gloria Steinem or, any of these people out there saying, hey, Anti-Defamation League, you shouldn't be honoring this guy who has exploited women. No, because, well, let's be honest about it. Again, it comes down to the fact that he's Jewish.
Would be anti-Semitic.
You can't complain about anything that Jewish organizations do because, well, there was a Holocaust.
Right.
The Holocaust is another subject for another discussion, but that's what people say. Oh, there was a Holocaust. Or, the guy who runs the local candy shop in my corner is Jewish, and he's a nice fellow. Or, my doctor's Jewish. He's a wonderful man. Or, my Jewish neighbor sends me a Christmas card every year. That's what happens when you bring up the attack on the USS Liberty by Israel, and you hear about someone's Jewish neighbor who plays Christmas music during the holidays,
Right.
Or you hear about the nice Jewish man the nice Jewish tailor. And I know a lot of nice Jewish tailors, and I know nice Jewish people who send Christmas cards, but I'm just talking about the reality of power politics. That's really what it comes down to.
Of course, so, that's separate from any of this stuff.
Yeah,
and that's,
exactly.
I think that's the problem.
So, this is what we're dealing with. Even this whole thing with Las Vegas is interesting because in this book, my book, Ye Shall Know the Truth, I talk a little bit about Las Vegas, and I cite a book, I'll tell you right here and now, it's The Money and the Power,
right.
The Making of Las Vegas and Its Hold on America. And it's written by two respected authors, mainstream authors, Sally Denton and Roger Morris, who is now her ex-husband. Both have published multiple books. Morris was a former officer on the National Security Council. Can't get much higher than that, okay? I doubt anyone's going to say he's a traitor to America, but what's interesting about this mainstream book, The Money and the Power, is that Morris and his then wife, are very straightforward and call attention to the fact that Las Vegas and Jewish crime syndicate figures in Las Vegas have not only been actually deeply involved in a multiple respects in the founding of the State of Israel, but that Israel has intersected, Israel and the Jewish lobby and Jewish crime interests connected to Las Vegas have intersected on a very high level, an intimate level, with the American political process for now well more than half a century. They pull no punches about this. They make it clear that it was not ever. Everybody thinks the Mafia controls Las Vegas. Denton and Morris make it very clear that it wasn't the Mafia. It was Meyer Lansky, Jewish-born, I think Russia, in part of Poland, which is now Russia, or vice versa. Jewish-born, rose to the top. He was the head of the mob. No, it wasn't Frank Costello. It wasn't Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano, in his own memoirs, says that Meyer Lansky took over the mob, and they were good friends. You know, these are all the details that are there. Another thing that Morris and Denton get into in their book, and they've never been called conspiracy theorists, and as I say, Roger Morris was on the National Security Council. You know, I mean, these are respectable people, not right-wing nuts or not, these guys, okay, they say, and it's no surprise to anyone who knows the story, but yes, in fact, the CIA worked very closely with the Jewish-controlled crime syndicate owners of the casinos in Las Vegas. The casinos in Las Vegas have not only been a font for money laundering for the mob, but the CIA has laundered some of its own covert operations money through those casinos. And that's part of the reason why the casinos have largely been allowed to engage in a lot of, shall we say, extracurricular activities, precisely because they have a get-out-of-jail-free card because of their cooperation with the CIA and other U.S. government intelligence agencies. Former National Security Council officer Roger Morris talks about it in his book. Now, like I say, if I were talking about this stuff, people would say, oh, well, that Piper's a conspiracy theorist. He doesn't like Jewish people. He likes Hitler. He doesn't believe in the Holocaust, this kind of thing. Well, don't pay attention to me. Pay attention to this former officer of the National Security Council. And if you doubt that the Jews control, the Jewish organized crime interests control the casinos in Las Vegas, I refer in the book to Professors Ronald Farrell and Carol Case at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Respected scholars. They've written the book, The Black Book and the Mob, The Untold Story of the Control of Nevada's Casinos. And this book was not published by Conspiracy Theories, Inc. It was published by the University of Wisconsin Press, which is a pretty respected mainstream publishing house. And in that book, they basically say, well, no, they say this. They say, I'll tell you what I write in the book about it. I have the book here. I say that enforcement of gambling laws and regulations in Nevada has largely been targeted against relatively small-time Italian mafia figures. In contrast, in their words, the quote-unquote regulatory reaction to Jews, unquote, has been, in their words, somewhat at variance with that to Italians. And here's what I wrote. I say, in short, the primary big-time casino owners and controllers, many of whom were Jewish and tied to organized crime, were relatively unhindered by law enforcement. This, Farrell and Case suggested somewhat gingerly, may have to do with the fact that political interests were, as they put it, quote, becoming sensitized to the persecution of Jews. Well, what that means is that you're not allowed to, if Jews are involved in criminal activities, in organized crime and so forth, you really shouldn't say too much about it because Jewish people have been persecuted throughout the centuries, and, well, it's just not nice to persecute people, and even if they are involved in criminal activity, you have to kind of excuse it because, well, they've been forced into it because, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
That's what they're saying.
Right.
But,
so they, like you said, they get a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's kind of like reverse racism.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's just this odd, and in the book I point out that Hank Messick, one of the great writers on organized crime, the name Messick, I always thought it sounded like a Jewish name. To the best of my knowledge, he's not. He's now deceased. He isn't Jewish, but in multiple books that he's written about the history of organized crime in America, he makes it very, very clear that Jewish influence has predominated. But, of course, he's been attacked as an anti-Semite, but because he he was already had a well-established reputation as a crime writer. It kind of was hard to make the label stick. And anybody who reads Hank Messig's books, most of which unfortunately are out of print, but which are easily accessible in secondhand editions. I think some of his books may have been reprinted by some small publishers, but you can go to Amazon.com and find books by Hank Messick, Messick, and you can't help but read these books, and it's very, very clear that the Jews have predominated in organized crime. The whole Italian-American image, is just not there. And, it's kind of funny. Even among Italian-Americans, there's they like to cling to the idea that the mob was always run by Italians. I've had friends who were of Sicilian heritage who were practically offended that I was suggesting that the Jews had more power in organized crime than their fellow Sicilians.
Well, Mike, come on.
Yeah, it's kind of like they've almost bought into, and they may have had some mob connections in their own family. But the real truth is it was the Jews, so to speak. But the other point about that, which is kind of interesting, is that there is a lot of writing about organized crime that's very interesting. The history of organized crime that deliberately tries to downplay the significance of Meyer Lansky, and particularly among some writers who write about the Kennedy assassination and who like to focus on the idea that the Mafia was behind it. And they always say it was the Mafia. Some people will say the mob, but even these people, they are very, very careful to, if they even mention Meyer Lansky at all, they will mention him only peripherally and say that he was a Jewish member of the crime syndicate who was associated with so-and-so. Well, not according to Charlie Luciano, Lucky Luciano.
Yeah, he would have known a little bit about that, right?
Yeah. Everybody knows the name Lucky Luciano, but how many people know that Lucky Luciano said that Meyer Lansky basically aced him out and took over organized crime? That's what Luciano says in his memoirs.
Amazing.
Yeah, if you don't believe me, listen to what Lucky has to say,
Right, but even this one point, Mike, here, which today, in 2013, very few people are telling the truth about this figure, Meyer Lansky, today.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible.
It's funny. There was an Italian-American crime figure named Jimmy Allo, A-L-O, who was very close to Meyer Lansky. They were friends. And I've seen it represented in some writings on organized crime. And frankly, especially when it comes from Jewish writers or people who are known to have some sort of Jewish influence or Jewish sympathy affecting them, they will say that Jimmy Allo was a Mafia figure assigned to keep an eye on Meyer Lansky. Or they will write that Meyer Lansky, they will imply that Meyer Lansky was a hanger-on of Jimmy Allo's. And that Jimmy Allo, and I forget which crime family, and it was an Italian crime family that Jimmy Allo was associated with. But, they go through these unusual hoops to try to suggest that Meyer Lansky was nobody.
Oh, my God.
Or that he was a minor figure. You know what I mean? And that's just not true. And all the, even Carlos Marcello, the legendary, beyond any question, legendary leader of the mob in New Orleans, what you have to keep in mind about Carlos Marcello is that Carlos Marcello, first of all, he was when he came to power as head of the mob in Louisiana, he was not part of the traditional Sicilian family. I forget the name of the original family that ran the mob in New Orleans. And keep in mind, I mean, for those who don't know, New Orleans is a very ethnic community. There's a lot of French, a lot of Italians, a lot of Irish, not to mention the large black population in the old days before Hurricane Katrina.
You mean
so there
chocolate,
was,
right?
There was an Italian crime
you
syndicate in New Orleans, but what happened was essentially Meyer Lansky and his partners, his early partners, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, they went in and they said, we're going to take over New Orleans. And they basically forced the original Italian crime boss out, and they put Carlos Marcello in charge. And he was a very powerful man. He was unquestionably a very wealthy man, very powerful, and consequently, he became the legendary figure associated with, quote-unquote, the Mafia. But actually, in many respects, Carlos Marcello, I don't want to call him a front man, but he was a very high-ranking, close associate of the National Crime Syndicate, particularly Meyer Lansky. They're the ones who set him up in power down there. Just like happened in California, there were native, shall we say, native Italian crime syndicate forces in California. I think the leader, and this is off the top of my head, was Jack Dragna. Well, the Lansky crime syndicate came in, and they fought with Dragna for years, and it was Bugsy Siegel, the famous Bugsy Siegel, who was a longtime friend and partner of Meyer Lansky. It was Bugsy Siegel who came in, set up shop in California, and basically took over California crime syndicate operations on behalf of the Jewish syndicate with Meyer Lansky and company. And then, of course, later they rubbed out Bugsy Siegel, and Mickey Cohen came in and took over. Mickey Cohen has become a little more prominent now as a consequence of this new action film, Gangster Squad, that came out a few years ago, a year or two ago. Very entertaining film, but not exactly historically accurate. I mean, I've written a bit about Mickey Cohen. I've had some interesting sources on him, including the late Gary Ween, who I knew personally, who was a beat cop in Hollywood for many years and knew Mickey and knew his operations. And in fact, a new biography of Mickey Cohen that came out a few years ago actually cites some of the things that I've said about Mickey Cohen in my own writings. But
wow.
Anyway, the point being that the Jewish crime forces took over New Orleans. They took over Los Angeles. Even Santo Trafficante, the legendary Italian-American crime figure down in Tampa, he had a choice some years before in his existence whether to line up with Meyer Lansky or whether to retain his traditional allegiances. He chose Meyer Lansky, according to Hank Messick's work. And other writers, too, have pinpointed Trafficante's key role in some of the very international operations in drug smuggling and other things that were directly linked to what you can only say is the Lansky Syndicate. And just for the record, I should mention that it was the Lansky Syndicate that was in charge of the casinos in the Caribbean. Lansky and his associates were the guys who set up the early people setting up Swiss bank accounts in Switzerland, holding Jewish mob money here in the United States. And what's interesting is that, of course, there were Jews in that's one of the big secrets about the Swiss banks. And you hear about all these poor German Jews whose money was in Swiss banks, and then they they got taken away by the Nazis. Well, a lot of the reason why a lot of these people were taken away by the Nazis, and the reason why they had money in Swiss bank accounts, was because they were Jewish gangsters in Germany. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people that were originally picked up by the Gestapo when Hitler took power, they were Jewish gangsters. And consequently, they did lose their money in Swiss bank accounts because it was crime money. It was blood money. That's just what the United States does today. If someone is involved in criminal activity and they get arrested, what does the government do? They seize their bank accounts because the money comes from drugs or gambling or prostitution or whatever. So what Adolf Hitler did, what the Germans did when they arrested a lot of these Jewish gangsters, why do you think all these people had all this money in the first place when the rest of the Germans were starving? They were involved in a lot of criminal activity. That's a peripheral matter here, but it relates to these Swiss bank accounts.
But it's important because that's the root of it. And let me ask you, is this written about at all in the mainstream, or is this one of the things you got to just piece together like a lot of?
I mean, you can start looking at the origin. For example, as a matter of Swiss bank accounts, I mean, they're legendary now, but, it's been written that it was Meyer Lansky himself who first, in fact, I believe it was his Israeli biographers.
You wrote about them
Melman
in the book.
And
yeah.
I forget their names off the top of my head. I can never remember authors' names anymore. But that it was Meyer Lansky who pioneered the use of Swiss bank accounts to launder criminal funds, and that he was one of the first ones to introduce. He was one of the first ones to introduce American politicians to the concept of putting their money in Swiss bank accounts, bribe money. Now, in fact, the allegation has been made, and I believe it. I'm a big fan and admirer of Huey Long, but it's been alleged that Meyer Lansky and company passed along a lot of bribes to Huey Long, and as a convenience for Huey, they set up a bank account for him in Switzerland, and consequently, Huey didn't have time to take trips to Switzerland or any other politicians around the United States. Well, Lansky and company would very nicely courier the money to Switzerland for these politicians. And these politicians, whenever they needed any money, could get it. But, of course, this is how it's done. So consequently, a lot of politicians, they didn't make trips to Switzerland themselves, and they'd have to rely on their trusted friends in the mob to handle the funds for them. So Meyer Lansky was brilliant, no question about it. So when they bought the politicians, they kept them even more closely bought by taking care of their funds for them in the Swiss bank accounts. Mm-hmm. And again, that's when you start looking at all the big controversy over the Swiss bank accounts a few years ago when they were saying how all the money had been taken from these poor Jews. Well, a lot of those poor Jews, as I say, they were coming from they were German families who were involved in German Jewish families who were involved in syndicate activities there. And that is, in fact, anybody who looks at the honest history of Weimar Germany, you do see that Jews were very active in underworld activities in the black market. And consequently, they, and what you found is they too were putting their money in Swiss bank accounts. So is it any coincidence then that it was Edgar Bronfman, who was, as head of the World Jewish Congress, leading the charge against the Swiss banks? His own father and Meyer Lansky were his grandfather and Meyer Lansky, his father, Sam Bronfman, and Meyer Lansky were business partners. They were the guys who were the pioneers in bribing politicians and putting the money in Swiss bank accounts for them. So if anybody knew any of the big secrets about the Swiss bank accounts, it was Edgar Bronfman. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of that money in the Swiss bank accounts was Jewish crime syndicate money. So, it's just all there. It's all there. I mean, it's acknowledged to certain degrees in certain hints that are dropped. But I mean, that's when you look at the bigger picture, you can get a pretty clear image of what it's all about.
Okay,
because
but
I
Mike,
mean, the money laundering. It's funny. You look at you just kind of take it back for a moment. You look at the book. I forget the name of it now, and I think it's cited in "Ye Shall Know the Truth." It's by one of the mainstream respected crime writers, and it's a book about Las Vegas. And it lists the names of the people who are on the boards of directors of these casinos, and looks at and it lists the names of the people who are shareholders in the casinos. Now, again, everybody thinks these casinos are owned by, quote unquote, the Mafia. If you look at the names, there's Jewish dentists in Beverly Hills and old Jewish widows in Cleveland, and Jewish, these people. If some of these people are legitimate owners who have put money in, but a lot of the other ones are people with some Jewish gangster's mother, things like this. I mean, that's what it is. Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. In this one book that I'm talking about, I'm going to see if I can find a reference to it. I'm pretty sure it's referenced in the book some point or another. I know I've cited it in some of my other works. But I was looking at one of the references to a bank in the Caribbean. A bank in the Caribbean, which was a money laundering operation for the Lansky crime syndicate. And I'm looking at the board of directors, and I say, I'll be damned, I know this guy. And, the funny thing about it is, he wasn't Jewish. He was a longtime reader of the Spotlight, very sympathetic to our point of view. But he lived in the Caribbean, and one of the things he had done in his career was he was a front man for organized crime in some bank, the name of which escapes me. I don't have the information in front of me. But he was very enthusiastic about my book, Final Judgment, which says a lot about the Jewish Lansky crime syndicate in the Kennedy assassination alongside the Mossad and elements inside the CIA. And he bought extra copies of Final Judgment and asked me to send them to a couple of his associates who he thought would be interested in the book. And lo and behold, when I got the two labels for the people he wanted to book sent to, one of them was another figure in that same organized crime bank. It was a front for the Lansky syndicate for money laundering in the Caribbean, and this guy shared our political point of view. That's why he subscribed to the Spotlight. And he was very, and he found his own bank was mentioned in the book, and he thought his other mob associate would be interested in it as well. And, I'll tell you what, the world gets even smaller. The world gets even smaller because, and the other guy was not Jewish either, by the way. I think he was an Arab. But what's really funny is about 10 years later, I happened to be trying to contact. I don't want to go into the details because it's not a personal matter, but I was trying to contact someone who is quite internationally known and who I happen to know. And so I'm making some phone calls, and she didn't happen to be where I knew she was at her home. And they said, well, you can find so-and-so. She is at the home of so-and-so, and they gave me the number. And when I found out that it turned out it was this same mob figure who had been involved in the money laundering bank in the Caribbean. So it's a very small world. There's a lot of famous people who intersect with some not so famous people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, in the world of organized crime and money laundering. And some of these people are very respected people, and some of them don't have anything to do with criminal activity at all. But again, it points out the fact that the upper world is very tightly knit, but it's also interwoven with the underworld. And it's a very, very small world when it comes right down to it, as I say. You know what I mean? It's very interesting, and that's just the way it is.
Do you agree with me, Mike, that this might be, so far at least, or one of the most important chapters of the book?
Yes, I would agree with you, Dave. In fact, when you had alluded to that, or I shouldn't say alluded, you had commented that last evening when we were talking on the American Free Press Editors Roundtable, which broadcasts here at AmericanFreePress.net, and you said that. And, as you said that, I was kind of putting the book together in my mind. In other words, I was thinking about the book, and yes, in fact, that is correct, because, as much as there are chapters on foreign policy, several chapters relating to foreign policy, and several, and other chapters on government policy in general. And while I consider foreign policy to be the paramount policy in terms of maintaining the sovereignty of a nation and nations, the one thing that unites all the people is the fact that they live within a geographic portion of the world and presumably pay taxes to that and expect services from that. So foreign policy is the one thing that unites the country in that respect. We might fight over every other issue, but ultimately we are all quote-unquote Americans, so to speak. Now, somebody may take issue with that for some reason or another, but I'm just talking generally here. But the one thing that does affect foreign policy and all other domestic policy, because it affects government, is the fact that the crime syndicate does intersect at so many levels on an intimate way with government. And in fact, this crime syndicate has been dominated by Jewish interests, which historically have, in fact, had their own political agenda. And oftentimes it does directly impact on U.S. foreign policy. So yes, that was a very long answer to your question, but yes, absolutely, in a way that I never really thought about until last night when you said that to me. And see, that's why it is so important. You know what I mean? Because even down to that level, that if you just look, you can't look at the Anti-Defamation League again in a vacuum. I mean, it's out there as a Jewish lobby group. And the average person might say, oh, well, they're Jewish people who are concerned about Israel, or they're Jewish people who want to protect Jewish people from criticism, unjust criticism. And, even granted that that's true, to whatever degree it is true or not true, but the fact is there's been a lot of Jewish crime syndicate-connected money bankrolling the Anti-Defamation League. And I can tell you, it has been argued, I think quite convincingly by a number of writers, that one of the reasons why the Anti-Defamation League was launched in the first place was to counter growing criticism that Jews were playing an inordinate part, if not the predominant part, in organized crime activity on American shores in the early part of this century. The head of the New York Police Department, I'm not sure. I think he was chief of police caught hell years ago because he was arresting too many Jews. And the reason why he was arresting Jews is because they were burning down buildings and they were pickpockets and they were involved in white slavery and they were involved in gambling and they were involved in breaking and entering. And consequently, they said he was anti-Semitic. Well, no, he was just picking up criminals. He wasn't saying, let's get the Jews. He was picking up criminals. And people were starting to realize that there was a rising Jewish influence in organized crime. Now, everybody, even baseball fans who might not know anything about politics, have heard about the fixing of the World Series by Arnold Rothstein. Well, Arnold Rothstein was the biggest Jewish gangster in America, and he's the guy who actually sponsored Meyer Lansky and some of Meyer Lansky's non-Jewish associates, like Lucky Luciano and Luciano, Frank Costello. The movie Mobsters tells part of that story. Good movie, entertaining film. It tells part of that story and in a pretty accurate way. Hollywood, of course, but it's probably one of the more accurate films in that degree. The current series, Boardwalk Empire, while highly fictionalized, gives you some glimpses into the realities of all of this and the early story. But again, it's not all necessarily truthful. I mean, in terms of factual details. But anyway, the point is, yes, that there has been this element in organized crime. In fact, I'll tell you, it's just an interesting sidelight here. There is a book with a rather awkward title, and again, the title escapes me, and the name of the author escapes me, but he's an Englishman. And this book is about the Jack the Ripper case. And there have been a lot of books on the Jack the Ripper case. And I've read quite a few of them. I'm probably one of the few people that have read probably as many as 10 or 15 books on Jack the Ripper. Just kind of, I'm interested in a lot of things. You know, I mean, I read books about dolphins, too. That will probably shock a lot of people. I read books about bears. You know what I mean? You know, I have a lot of interests above writing about Jewish power in America, but it's a political interest that's, I think an important subject. But at any rate, this book on Jack the Ripper pinpoints one particular gentleman, as many of them do, as Jack the Ripper. But you actually read this book, which is a very substantial volume, and whether or not you buy the idea that this particular guy is Jack the Ripper, you come away with the absolute understanding that Jews in the later part of the 19th century, and certainly in the early days of the 20th century, were very influential in international crime, white slavery, prostitution, gambling, the drug trade, fencing, as in, you know, dealing in stolen goods and so forth, and that these criminal activities were not just national, they were international. And, you know, it's kind of funny, in reflecting on this book, which is a massive book, only a small part of which really is devoted to the thesis that this one particular Jewish criminal was probably Jack the Ripper, or could have been Jack the Ripper. I almost had the idea that the guy who wrote the book was actually writing a book about international Jewish crime syndicates in the late part of the 19th century. And in the course of this, he came across this figure who he perceived to be perhaps Jack the Ripper, or he could make a good argument that he was. And so therefore, rather than billing his book as a history of Jewish predominance in the crime syndicates, he chose rather to say, hey, here's the latest theory on Jack the Ripper. But it's a fascinating book. I think it's something like The Fox and the Flies, or some odd title, and I'm sorry, anybody who's really interested in pursuing the book can easily find it, I'm sure, if they do a search of Jack the Ripper and use the terms fox and possibly the word flies. And as I say, it's written by a British scholar. But anyway, the point is, this is not just some new phenomenon. And it's very interesting because some years ago, a Jewish writer...
We're down to 10 seconds, Mike.
Okay, a Jewish writer said that, hey, guess what? Jewish crime was very predominant in Germany, and the Nazis were not lying about it.
Mike, I knew this. I knew I loved this chapter for a reason. Next, this is Friday. Now on Tuesday, same time, Chapter 6, America's most publicized political scandal, the hidden facts about Watergate. Mike, thank you for taking the time out and emptying your brain about this wonderful chapter. This is so important. I just want to let listeners know that.
That was the tip of the iceberg, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I know that. But this book, You Shall Know the Truth,